Welcome back to Anatomy Lab, guys. I miss seeing your faces. This week's lab will be on Unit 10, which is the Blood Vessels and Blood Lab. This lab starts on page 143 of your lab books. The lab pages that will be due on April 20th, next Monday, are labeling pages 149 to 152 with the terms in the green boxes, and you can just take pictures of those pages and then upload them to the assignments in Canvas. Most of you have figured out how to do that. Like usual, there will be a quiz on this lab, the terms in the green boxes, also on Monday, April 20th. And like usual, I will open that quiz up at 8 a.m., leave it open up for 24 hours to finish that. So the first part of this unit is on the formed elements of blood and the histology of the blood vessel wall. There aren't necessarily terms in any green boxes for this part, so you should just read through that and be familiar with this information. You'll cover it in lecture, and you'll also learn more about this when you get to AP151 physiology. Real briefly, the formed elements of blood refer to the erythrocytes, or your red blood cells, the platelets, which are elements of blood that help in blood clotting, and then leukocytes, which are your white blood cells. They help with the immune response. You have 5 types of leukocytes, and they are either granulocytes or agranulocytes. Then if we jump to the histology of the blood vessel wall, the walls of blood vessels is slightly different whether we're talking about a vein or an artery, but they both have 3 similar layers. The tunica intima is the innermost layer, the tunica media, and the tunica externa. I'll briefly talk about the blood vessel wall layers. They're called tunics. The tunic intima is composed of simple squamous lining endothelium. The tunica media is composed of circularly arranged smooth muscle, and the sympathetic activity from your nervous system will cause vasoconstriction, or the constriction of these blood vessels within the tunica media muscle layers. And then the tunica externa is the outer connective tissue layer that helps anchor your blood vessels to their surroundings. So like usual, your blood vessels aren't just hanging out in your body, they're anchored to tissues or muscles surrounding them. Here is just a microscopic comparison of an artery or vein. I think it's kind of interesting to see here. In real lifetime, veins are really thin-walled, they're collapsible, and arteries have a thick muscular tunica media layer. And this is just a comparison chart of arteries and veins. You probably have a table similar like this in your textbook in lecture 2. Here are the sizes of arteries and veins. The biggest arteries are called elastic arteries, and these are the ones closest to the heart, like your aorta, descending aorta. And then we have muscular arteries. Those are the sizes of most of the arteries in your body. Arterioles are the smallest artery. Then we get to capillaries, again, where gas exchange and nutrient exchange occurs. And then capillaries lead to venules, which are comparable to arterioles, but in veins. And then small to medium-sized veins. And then large veins will be your inferior and superior vena cava, which again dump blood, deoxygenated blood, into your right atrium. Okay, so now we'll look at some specific types of arteries and veins that you'll be labeling and working through in your green box terms. So we'll start on page 148 of your lab book, and I'll try to hit as many of these terms as I can. So it looks like, coming off of the heart, we have the ascending aorta, and the ascending aorta kind of curves around in what we call the aortic arch. And off of the aortic arch, we have 3 main branches. We're just going to work our way from right to left anatomically of these 3 branches. The first branch off of the aorta is called the brachiocephalic trunk. And the brachiocephalic trunk, you can see branches a little bit further up into your right subclavian artery, which goes to your shoulder, and the right common carotid artery, which goes up to the side of your neck into your brain. Then the second branch off of the arch of the aorta is your left common carotid, And your left common carotid goes up the left side of your neck. So your common carotid arteries go up the sides of your neck, one on the right side and one on the left side. And your subclavian arteries go to your shoulders. The right subclavian goes to your right shoulder, your left subclavian goes to your left shoulder. Then the aorta, as you know, kind of curves around and changes names to the descending aorta. And the descending aorta, we can call it the thoracic or abdominal descending aorta. It's called thoracic if it's referring to the part of the descending aorta that's above the diaphragm, and it's called the abdominal descending aorta if it's below the diaphragm. And you can see in this picture where your aorta peeks out in the diaphragm itself. Your descending aorta then splits into a right and left common iliac artery, and you're probably wondering, why does your descending aorta need to split? And that is just logical. It'll split to eventually bring blood supply to both sides of your legs. I know this slide is really hard to see, so I'm not going to go into too much detail here. I'm looking at your list. You have an internal and an external carotid artery, which are branches off of your common carotid artery. You can see them really briefly. And again, I'm sorry the picture is so small on the right side of this screen. The external and internal carotid artery, as you guys are labeling the internal and external carotid artery, you'll see your common carotid artery go up the side of the neck of the person in the skull model on page 149. Your common carotid artery will split into an external carotid artery, which will stay along the surface of the skull, and your internal carotid artery will actually go into the skull. Then, as we're also going, you'll see the subclavian arteries will eventually branch again. Okay, so let's look at the arteries of the upper limb. Your right subclavian is listed here. Both subclavians take blood supply to your shoulders, and the subclavian artery eventually changes names into the axillary artery in the shoulder region of the upper arm. The axillary artery changes names into the brachial artery, and the brachial artery will eventually split to go down the ulnar side of the arm and the radial side of the arm. And I'm going to let you guys find the mistake that's in this PowerPoint slide that I just saw myself. The radial side of the arm will always be the lateral thumb side of the arm. So in this slide, your radial and ulnar artery are actually not named correctly. Your radial artery always follows along the thumb side or lateral side of your arm, and your ulnar artery follows along your ulna side or medial side, the side where your pinky finger will be. As we move our way down from the descending aorta, there's branches that come off the descending aorta, and we call these abdominal arteries, the branches that come off the descending aorta below the diaphragm. And as we work our way down, the first major branch off the descending aorta is your celiac trunk. And we call it a trunk artery because it eventually will split into 3 different arteries. But the celiac trunk is the first branch that comes off your descending aorta. The next major branch that comes off is the superior mesenteric. And then further on down, way at the bottom, we have our inferior mesenteric artery. Other branches off of the abdominal descending aorta will be gonadal arteries, which will be close to your inferior mesenteric. You'll have a right and left gonadal artery, which take blood supply to the gonads of the body. So these will be the testes in a male or the ovaries in a female. Then you have a right and a left renal artery, which will take blood to the kidneys. You'll have a common iliac artery, which is just the name for when your descending aorta splits. So you'll have a right and a left common iliac artery. And eventually the common iliac artery, when it passes this inguinal ligament, which is shown here, it changes names into a femoral artery, which is the name of the artery that brings blood supply to your upper leg. This is a little bit better picture of the descending abdominal aorta and the different branches off of it. You can see the celiac trunk. These will be arteries that come off the anterior side of the descending aorta. Celiac trunk is shown there. Superior mesenteric is right underneath it. And further on down is inferior mesenteric. And then the arteries that come off in pairs off the sides of the aorta. If we start at the top, we have renal arteries bringing blood to your kidneys, gonadal arteries, which bring blood to the gonads, which I don't think, yep, they are labeled on this picture, but they're labeled testicular and ovarian artery, or also known as gonadal arteries. And then you can see here the common iliac artery is the splitting of the descending aorta, and it eventually changes names into the femoral artery after it passes that inguinal ligament. As we look at some of the arteries on the underside of the brain, I'm on page 150 of your green terms. The basilar artery and the vertebral arteries and the circle of Willis. If you look at the underside of the brain, you can see kind of this circular pattern of these arteries, and that's known as the circle of Willis, and there's different arteries that make up that circle of Willis. Your internal carotid artery, you can see where that is located coming up into that circle. The anterior cerebral artery makes up the front part or anterior part of the circle of Willis. The anterior and posterior communicating arteries, you can see here anterior communicating artery and posterior communicating artery. And then the posterior cerebral artery, you can see where that is located. So again, these are just arteries that make up this circle of Willis. The basilar and vertebral arteries, the basilar artery you can see is located, comes just inferior to that circle of Willis. And the vertebral artery will eventually go from your basilar artery into your vertebra. And I think that covers the arteries that you need to know from the brain model. So just be sure to double check your labeling when you're labeling that picture on page 150 for the underside of the brain. Then we get into the veins, and thankfully the veins are kind of similar in nomenclature to the arteries, but not exactly the same. We'll start with the branches that come off of the heart. And again, I apologize, this picture is a little tiny. I'm going to focus in on this zoomed in version of just the heart with the diaphragm in the picture. So we know where our superior and inferior vena cava are. The inferior vena cava brings blood back to the heart all the way from your lower limbs. So if we start way at the bottom of the inferior vena cava, you'll see your right and left common iliac veins. And again, you remember that in arteries, we call them right and left common iliac arteries. So far, so good. So your right and left common iliac veins bring blood up from your legs. Then they meet together to form your inferior vena cava, which drains blood into the right atrium. The superior vena cava drains blood from your upper limbs and your head, neck region, and your superior vena cava splits or bifurcates, which is a fancy name for splitting, into the right and left brachiocephalic veins. Your right and left brachiocephalic veins eventually split again into internal jugular veins, which go up your neck, and subclavian veins, which go to your shoulder. You'll see here in this guy's neck, you can see the internal jugular vein is kind of a main branch that comes off of your brachiocephalic, and your external jugular vein is a smaller branch that comes off of it. Same type of thing as the carotids, but your internal and external jugular veins, one will stay on the internal side and one will stay on the external surface. Your subclavian veins will eventually change names to axillary veins in the axilla region of your shoulder or the armpit region. Axillary veins change names into brachial veins. Brachial veins change their name into radial and ulnar veins. And again, the radial vein is on the thumb side, the lateral side of the forearm, and the ulnar vein will be on the medial pinky side of the forearm. You have what we call the median cubital vein, and the median cubital vein will be right kind of where you'll often get poked if you need a blood sample drawn. So it's kind of in that where your elbow creases, where you bend your elbow, that's the median cubital vein. So this is the last slide that I have for you. It's a more zoomed in version of your lower thoracic and abdominal branches off of your vein branches off of your inferior vena cava. The hepatic portal vein, let's see if it's listed. There are hepatic veins shown in this picture. They're kind of the first major branch off of your inferior vena cava below the diaphragm. The hepatic portal system or hepatic portal veins is the body's way of draining all the blood that goes to the liver. So your liver helps to detox and kind of cleanse out all the bad things that you ingest and inhale. So anything that goes through your digestive tract or that gets in your blood will go through your liver. And the hepatic portal system is just a series of veins that drains all the blood from your liver. So you can see your hepatic portal veins or hepatic veins there. Renal veins, where do you think your renal veins go to? The kidney. Gonadal veins will drain blood from your gonads, testes, or ovaries. And then your common iliac vein, again, is just the branching off of your inferior vena cava. And just like your arteries, your common iliac vein changes names to the femoral vein once it passes this inguinal ligament. That's all I have for you for this slide. I hope you guys are all doing healthy and well. Take care.